Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. A formal party of opposition is a more recent curiosity of our Westminster system of government. While no politician would seek to be in opposition, mastering the art of opposition will most likely result in becoming the government. For Robert Menzies, who was opposition leader for 6 years from 1943 to 49, being in opposition was an opportunity for study and thought. As he said, it must be regarded as a great constructive period in the life of a party, properly considered, not a period in the wilderness, but a period of preparation for the high responsibilities which you hope will come. Joining me to discuss the art of opposition is policy advisor and academic Dr. Scott Prasser. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Scott.
G'day.
Well, it's lovely to have you here in extremely chilly Melbourne, and you're all the way down from much milder Brisbane. So I'm glad you've braved the cold with your jumper.
Well, we think it's cold in Brisbane too.
Yeah. I think your version of cold is quite different from mine. But Scott, you've just written a beautiful book, well, I should say edited and written part of, a beautiful book on the art of opposition with David Clune. It's actually a fascinating collection of contributions from people from Australia and around the world. And, of course, a very understudied area of academic inquiry. So tell me, what was the inspiration behind writing this book?
Well, that's exactly the reason. There really hasn't been a book on Australian oppositions at all. Now, there's some overseas, so there's been a big gap there. Now, this project really started way back in 2011 with John Nethercote, who was the person who came up with the idea. We ran a conference and it was John's baby to do, but John never finished it, was really what happened. I moved on to parliamentary work, and the publisher really kept pressing me over the years, why don't you revive this project? So we did a year ago, and I rang up all the previous contributors, some who were no longer with us, so that was interesting. And most of them had not used their chapter at all. And so 7 of the existing chapters are ones which have been revised, and the other 14 are all new sort of thing. So in a way, it's become a bigger project than it was originally.
Well, thank you for persisting with it after all those years, after 13 years. So it's certainly not a quickly produced volume here. It is something that is deeply considered, and there is a lot of research that's gone on into it. I thought it'd be interesting to talk about how this concept of the formal opposition came about. I mean, there's lots of areas of life where people oppose particular groups or leaders or communities, but in our parliamentary system, we have this idea of a formal opposition. And when you say, the opposition, people in Australia generally know exactly what you mean. But it's a bit of a curiosity, isn't it? And quite a new one too.
Well, relatively new. It partly lies in the idea of Parliament having some control over the King, that the King has to get approval of their budgets and things like that. So even by the time of Elizabeth I, there was some notion that legislation had to get approved by Parliament. They gave priority to it and they all would agree to it, but there was a bit of negotiation in the background. The real thing I think that really started moving it was the Reformation, okay? So once you broke down the monopoly of the Catholic Church and you could say there are other ways to get to heaven, if you like, and you have a group of people who, while they like to respect authority, also didn't like the King intervening in their connection to God, if you like, right? So you have the Stuarts espousing divine right of kings, we are in charge. Parliament sort of saying, well, no, not quite. And you had a lot of Protestant type activity in the background saying, well, we don't want someone to tell us how to pray. And you had this idea that Parliament could reject things that the King put up, and without fear of retribution. Okay, That's the important thing happening. And that moved on. So you had by the 18th century the notion of a group in Parliament who weren't necessarily the King's party. You know, the King tried to appoint people. And by the time of George III, late 18th century, William Pitt the Younger, very young Prime Minister, as he was quite called, but he and the King colluded, if you like, to get appointments to Parliament to keep out the opposition and so on. And that's really came the idea of that concept of there was a party of opposition, loosely sort of coordinated, if you like. And when a different king arrived, he appointed different ministers from a different party, and the other mob went into opposition, if you like. So that's developed slowly around those things. Very factionalised, not too permanent, but you had the notion, certainly Pitt the Younger, who was a brilliant Prime Minister from the age of 24 till for about 15 or 16 years, really colluded to keep the other mob out in all sorts of ways. So that's how it sort of developed.
And what about in the Australian context? I mean, obviously we inherit the British Westminster system of government and parliamentary democracy, so inevitably what had developed in Westminster came here. But we also have our own idiosyncrasies, the development of the loyal opposition, don't we?
Yes, well, by the time Australia was founded, the colonies were becoming self-governing. The Westminster system was getting pretty firmly established, the idea of the opposition. And when we federated with the Constitution, now the opposition is not in the Constitution. So the opposition is in legislation and it's in convention, like so much of Westminster's system. So when they were drawing up the Constitution, that was intrinsic within the discussions. Responsible government, the government has to sit in Parliament, be responsible to Parliament, and the idea of His Majesty's at this time loyal opposition, which is a very interesting concept. That is, you can be an opposition, but you've got to be loyal to the Crown. And this is another notion where it's not the King so much at fault, it's the ministers, the King's ministers at fault that you criticise. You don't criticise the Crown, you criticise the King's ministers, right? That sort of notion. So we adopted that, and that basically became the way we operate.
So this idea of loyal opposition, I think there's a quote in the book that it's insurgency with responsibility, dissent with respect. So you accept the framework of the system in which you operate, but you are insurgent and dissenting in a constructive and respectful way.
Yes, and I think that all goes back to people like Walter Bagehot, who was the editor of The Economist, sort of saying the public expect to hear all sides of the story, all sides of the debate. Or David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, said, we've got two ears to hear both sides, which I think a lovely sort of way of saying it, that we should have open debate and discussion, right? So the British system, if you like, was ahead of the continental systems. Remember, the continental systems, the Prussian system was, the monarch was still pretty much in control. France had had a revolution, of course, and different versions of Napoleon and so on. So the British system, this concept of we should hear both sides, you can criticise the government of the day, and the role of the opposition is to hold the government of the day to account. That's basically what we're getting to.
So holding the government of the day to account, it's often used, and of course that's the aspiration. Menzies, in a broadcast just after the death of Ben Chifley, who had been his predecessor, the Labor Prime Minister, until 1949 when Menzies wins the election for the first time as a Liberal, on Chifley's death he says that parliaments are a great expression of democracy. Parliament is both an instrument of reasoned progress, largely because there are both government and opposition, the hammer and the anvil, forging ideas and making laws. And that really struck with me, that idea of a hammer and an anvil. You've got this sort of lump of steel or something in front of you, a law or a bill, and the government and the opposition are batting up against this piece of steel, creating something hopefully quite useful and potentially beautiful.
Yeah, that's the idea of debate. And while political parties, once they got developed, disciplined political parties, meant that the government of the day pretty much called the shots, there are all sorts of rules within parliamentary procedures that gives opposition opportunity to ask questions. It's the opposition's turn to ask the question, right? That's very interesting. The opposition has a right of reply to the budget, right? And of course, in Australia, what the real difference is, we've got a Senate, which is elected.
And we'll get on to the importance of the upper house, because that, of course, plays a particular role. But can you tell me, what are the advantages of having a formal opposition, like a government in waiting. Because you don't have that in, for example, the United States. Their system is a very different system from the Westminster system. But in Australia, in the UK, in Canada, there is this alternative party of government, and there's that sort of sense of a binary choice. Why is that a good thing?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head that the opposition is not just there to oppose, it is the government in waiting. So it's got to not just criticise, it's also got to criticise and say what we would do differently. What's our policies to make a difference in this area? I mean, anyone can criticise, the editorials of newspapers criticise, but they don't have to put up how you might do things differently. So in our system of government, unlike the United States, you have this loyal opposition who's obviously hold the government to account, to harass it to some extent, to provide alternative views, but also saying we could be the government tomorrow. So one of the great interesting things is on election night, the opposition the next day is the government, right? Bang. And they've got to be ready and willing to run the country. So now what this does, it gives the electorate choices. And I know you can be some criticism the choices aren't wide enough, they're not revolutionaries, they're working within the system, but it also makes that the opposition's got to come up with some fairly concrete ideas about what they want to do. And therefore the electorate can see back in Menzies' time, when Menzies brought out in 1954 his election, the leader of the opposition, Everett, proposed a whole range of spending things, right? Big spending, pension increases and all this sort of stuff, but the public didn't buy it. The public didn't buy it, literally weren't bought by it, in a sense, if you like.
Indeed.
And so that's an example. The public make a choice. And you're seeing that all around at the moment with the election going on in Queensland. The opposition has got to come up with not just, we're going to be better, how are you going to be better? Why should I place my vote with you? How are you going to be different from the lot in power now?
Something that's interesting about a formal opposition is this idea of a shadow ministry. And I was quite surprised to learn that that is also quite a recent phenomenon. And I think it really came about during the Menzies era and the later stages of the Menzies era in about 1965. So you've got the opposition leader, but you've got the sort of shadow minister for finance, the shadow treasurer, the shadow minister for foreign affairs. And there are particular individuals who are there as the minister in waiting, the alternative minister.
I think that's come about because governments become more complex, right, where once you had a group of people in the opposition who would take on different roles, as governments become more interventionists in the economy, in our society, particular issues of public policies, take treasury or take social welfare or take education, that's more complex. You've got to master the brief. I'm always interested how the opposition do sometimes master the brief and ask useful questions. So I think what's happened is as governments become more complex, as policies become more complex, and also the electorate wants to know if the education minister says X, well, what does the shadow minister think of this idea? What's your view? And that's, I think, why that's developed in that particular way. In America, they don't have anything like that. There's no concept of, there's no shadow. I mean, you have the Democrats and the Republicans hating each other and attacking each other, but there's no shadow Secretary of State in America, okay, who says, I would do this thing, because they don't know who the Secretary of State is going to be, and often is not in Congress.
No, so actually more often not in Congress. I mean, their committee system, I guess, is so powerful, and their scrutiny of the executive is really through their Senate committees.
Senate congressional system is very strong.
Yeah. So you see their scrutiny and the opposing views really put through that congressional system rather than through individuals who are the alternative minister.
But they don't call the president to congressional committees for cross-examination. The president doesn't have to face Congress in any shape or form like the Prime Minister has to. The president's a bit like the Queen or the monarch, if you like. They're above that fray. So you don't see the president sitting there in Congress answering questions from the other side of politics as such. And you've got also, the American politics is very fluid. You can have liberal Democrats, conservative Democrats, and all sorts of things depending on what region they come from and so on. So it's not quite as clear cut.
Something that's been a criticism of oppositions in the past, and actually just perhaps a point of analysis of why an opposition doesn't win an election or why they lose, is they either are a big target or a small target. Now, I mean, the big target, I guess, presupposes that they have a big policy agenda put forward before an election as an alternative to what the government's doing. It's also used as a reason they had a big target on their back and too many things to disagree with, and the public got nervous and thought, actually, we know what the government's doing, so we'll just stick with them as the known quantity. Do you think that this small target approach is something that we've seen in more recent years, or has it always been a strategy adopted by our oppositions in Australia?
Well, some oppositions take the view, we'll just let the government hang themselves, so to speak, and just stay there, and they'll put so many people off, we'll just walk in, and that has happened in the past. The person who really got the big program, the big target, was Gough Whitlam, right? So we didn't really have big election speeches and promises. Whitlam developed what was called the program. It was multiple pages long. It covered many areas, and he was doing that to mark out the change that he thought Australia needed. And that was seen as a big vote winner, though Whitlam didn't win a landslide at all. And that triggered all parties then to start developing big programs and policies and 25 different statements and so on.
A la John Hewson's Fight Back.
John Hewson's Fight Back, 150 pages and so on, but so complex no one could understand it, including Dr. Hewson sometimes on TV, or couldn't explain it, if you like, and Paul Keating nailed him several times. But we still do have lots of policies. But in recent times, you're seeing that oppositions are saying, look, if we put out too much, we get criticised, the media attack us, and therefore we'll adopt this more policy. And you're seeing that in action in Queensland. And there's a big problem with this. There's a big problem that if you then get into office and you start doing things, like we've seen the Albanese government. Albanese got elected because Scott Morrison was supposed to be such an awful person, and Mr Albanese is such a warm, cuddly person, and we all love him, and he's so kind and caring and so on. There wasn't a lot of talk about policy. There's no doubt that Morrison was way ahead of Albanese in terms of debating abilities and knowledge and things like that. So Albanese got on that. This is going to be easy. And you also might remember Rudd also sort of adopted a bit of that approach. You know, we're not going to be big spending government. We're going to be careful how we do things. Bob Hawke in the 83 election, I don't bring a fistful of dollars to the electorate and so on, trying to allay fears that they were going to be big spenders. But the problem with not having a wide ambit of what you want to do or being clear of what you want to do, A, it's dishonest with the electorate, right? So you get into office, you then got no mandate. So many of the things the Albanese government's doing now, there's no mandate about those things that they're doing. And so that's one problem. So we didn't mention that in our election promises. We only focused on 4 or 5 things. Well, that leaves you in a bit of an embarrassment. I also think that a lot of oppositions are scared to have the debate. They don't think they've got the ability to take on the flack that they might get. And you're seeing that in Queensland, where only 4 or 5 issues are being picked on, and there's lots of other issues are not being mentioned or discussed. How is the opposition in Queensland going to tackle the growing debt of Queensland, $188 billion? We don't know. And so you had the opposition leader a week or so ago saying he's going to go along with everything in the Labor budget. We want to have stability. Well, even if there's stupid things in the Labor budget, you're going to go along with it. That doesn't give voters an alternative. So I'm a great believer. You've all heard of the expression of speaking truth to power. That is the idea of public servants should tell the minister that that's a really dumb idea. That's speaking truth to power. But I think politicians should speak truth to people. Now, we saw that best, I think. Now, John Howard went to the 1996 election with a very strong industrial relations program. John Howard had been talking about industrial relations for a long time. No surprises. And they took it to Parliament, and it was amended 170 times by the Senate, but they accepted that to get it through. We knew what John Howard stood for. We didn't know what Kevin Rudd stood for when he got elected. And then you saw when John Howard had said there won't be a GST in the first term, that's dead and buried and so forth. And then he called an early election in 98 and said, I want to introduce a GST. He was speaking truth to the people, right? And the opposition did the appalling political thing, an opposition, the Labor Party, which had long supported a GST, then for political reasons ran a campaign against it.
Scott, how difficult is it, though, for an opposition to formulate a meaningful, robust policy agenda going into an election? I think of, Robert Menzies in the 1940s forming the Liberal Party of Australia, and they definitely had big ideological differences between the Liberals and the Labor Party back then. And of course, they run on an anti-socialisation agenda, which Ben Chifley's Labor government was certainly intent on socialisation of the Australian economy. And they don't get up in 46. But then again, they try in 49 and they are successful. And there was sort of stark differences, but it was years in the making, and it was an amazing amount of, I think, self-belief, like real belief in that agenda. But in today's political cycle, it seems like it's really hard to get time to come up with the policies and to be brave enough to champion something that can be quite radical.
Well, I think being brave enough is the issue. I think the thing that Menzies and other leaders did was they had a series of ideas for considerable time before the election.
Yeah.
Right? So they gradually, Menzies was talking about private housing way before 1949, right? And just remember, the conventional wisdom at the time was social housing and public housing. The Labor Party were adopting the British model of building government housing, council flats and sort of thing. The ALP minister at the time said, we don't want to create little capitalists sort of thing. Now, Menzies went against that. Menzies went against the 44 referendum just after he became leader again. And then you had the nationalisation of the banks and the airlines. So they'd put their stake in the ground way before the election, sort of knew the direction that they were developing and coming. Now, what's been lacking in some of the around Australia recently is the oppositions have been too afraid to put a stake in the ground about anything. So they are too agreeable with the government of the day. And I'll give you a very good example where I think you've got to put your stake in the ground beforehand and build support for it and test your policy to see what reaction there is before the election. In the election's 40 days, it's all rushed, and the public doesn't absorb all those policies being released. It's what you do before the election. I thought Howard's headland speeches were really good. We also knew a lot about John Howard, but he made these headline speeches around Australia on different areas, laying out some principles of things. And I'm a great supporter of Sir John Carrick's view of have the principles, then develop the policy, and then manage the politics, okay? Now, I think what happens too often, people are managing the politics before they thought about the principles. If you ask me what I thought the principles were of the leader of the opposition in Queensland, I don't know, okay? Because on so many areas we don't know what their views are. They haven't been stated over a period of time. Now, the opposition has been there for 9 years in Queensland. They are recovering from the Newman government that cut and all that sort of stuff far too quickly and probably too much perhaps, but that nevertheless had to be done. Certain things had to be done. But they've had time to repair that and to articulate how their government would be different from the incumbent government. That's what we want to know. So what would you do, for instance? Now, all public services in Australia, especially at the state level, but increasingly at the federal level, are politicised. What do you do with them? Do you sack everybody on a Sunday morning, ring everybody, hey, you're all sacked? How do we depoliticise the public service? How do we keep good people and so on? That needs to be articulated. So I think that oppositions have got to build their case over a period of time. I'll give you an example in the Abbott government. The Abbott government in education announced on budget night a deregulation of higher education. It had not been an election promise. It had not been mentioned, right? So he had to start all over again, the Minister of Education, Christopher Pyne, in getting support from the university sector and putting down all the exaggerated complaints about it and so on. It was quite a good policy, but it was announced sort of out of the blue.
It's an interesting point though, Scott. Opposition should offer the electorate something that is well thought out and that they've been talking about for not more than 40 days just before the election, that It is something perhaps that links to their value system, their philosophical outlook. But once you're in government, and maybe you've been in government for a term or so, I mean, you can't blame governments for coming up with new policies. Things change, things happen, events happen, of course, and you need to have a way of responding to them. So there has to be a balance, doesn't there, to not take the electorate by complete surprise by turning up in government on day one and then announcing a whole raft of policies no one's ever heard of before, but also allowing a government to have some flexibility to develop policies as the term progresses.
That's right. Now, the Whitlam government is an example of what happened when the program becomes the holy writ, right? So I'm told that there was a thing set up called the Priorities Review Committee by the Whitlam government. It had Austin Holmes, who was the chief economist from the Reserve Bank, who chaired it, and I've met Austin Holmes, and he told me that the government was running amok, the Whitlam government was running amok because it had all these things in the program, and all you had to do at Cabinet was say, oh, it's in the policy statement, it's in Goff's election speech, and it would go through. But some of these were contradictory, some of them were no longer appropriate, right? You remember they were created in opposition, and they were too costly, and the budget's going through the roof. Remember, education spending went from 400 million to 2 billion in 1 year or something. So he said what they did was they had a special weekend with the ministry. Remember, everyone was in the ministry in Whitlam. There's a whole 27 in one big happy family. And they put all the election promises.
Well, that was after he had been the Minister for everything. And
that's right.
There were three of them who were Minister for everything the first few days.
That's right.
Yes.
Lance Ballard. So they got all the ministers together and they put all the promises out on single promise X, and they asked all the ministers to prioritise them. Where would you put this promise about the alligators in Northern Territory or something? Where should that be, number 24 or number 54? And he said, of course, they couldn't agree. That was the point I'm making. And that's an example where you had too many detailed policies or programmatic processes, and that becomes the writ, regardless of the circumstances. The Harold Wilson government in England were the same. We're going to have 100 days of action, and then they had to have devaluation because the economy was completely overheating and so on and so forth. So that's where judgment comes in. But I think opposition should lay down clear principles and frameworks of what they're on about to both put down fears that we're going to do this and also so that when they get into office, I think one of the problems of people getting into office, and I've mainly worked in state governments, in federal government, in office, that you get so involved in the day-to-day gritty administration, you forget the strategic game going on.
Scott, it's often said that oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. What is it, though, that makes a good opposition? Is it just the inevitable they won the election and became the government, therefore they were a good opposition? I mean, there's some criticisms I think of, well, say Campbell Newman. He was obviously a great opposition leader, wins in a landslide, and then in government he's a one-termer. So let's be honest, the electorate gave him his report card at the end of his first term and it wasn't great. Tony Abbott's often held up as an example of an amazing opposition leader who was able to win an election but then found governing quite challenging, and of course his own party decided to remove him. I look at Ben Chifley, for example. He's a back nationalisation agenda in the late 40s. Menzies fought hard and hard and hard against that. Was it Ben Chifley who lost that election in his government because of that policy being so unpopular, or was it the Menzies program of opportunity, of enterprise, of individual freedom that captured the electorate and launched him into office? Well,
just imagine if Mr Menzies said, we'll go along with bank nationalisation, okay? Just imagine, we'll go along with the nationalisation of the airlines, okay? We'll go along with the referendum to give extended happen. I don't think Mr Menzies would have got elected because people were wanting to hear the alternative. And there's quite a good book which Linton Crosby, the Australian campaigner, seems to help the Conservative Party. I think it's a lost cause at the moment in England, deservedly so. But if the public only hears one side of the story, then that will become the conventional wisdom. That's the problem. And the problem I think non-Labor parties in opposition have, in particular, is they don't have another side of the story being articulated enough. And I know that the world's against them, the media they think is against them, and the universities are against them, and so on and so forth. But unless the public hears the alternative narrative, and I just think of Mr. Malcolm Fraser, and Malcolm Fraser had a 6% poll rating when he was the Industrial Relations Shadow Minister. No one thought Malcolm Fraser would become leader. Now, I have to say, I was a Malcolm Fraser fan, okay?
So you were in that 6%.
Very odd, very odd. Because Billy Snedden, and I've met Billy Snedden and I heard him speak at a function I organised, he suffered from policy Me Tooism. He was trying to soften the Liberal Party, bring it. I understand what Billy was on about. He did a good job trying to keep the party together. But it was Malcolm Fraser who stood apart. Malcolm Fraser talked about federalism and restraining government and all those sort of things. And it was that which the public turned to in the constitutional crisis, and he held firm. What if he agreed, what if the Liberals had agreed with that shonky loans deal that Gough Whitlam put together without even properly consulting Treasury and so on about it? What if the coalition had gone along with that shonky deal? Gough would have got away with it. So it was Fraser who strategically focused on those issues that won the biggest federal election landslide in history.
We've obviously talked quite a bit about the Commonwealth Government and the federal parliament and the federal opposition, but we of course have 6 states in Australia and not all their parliamentary systems are the same. Of course, you're from Queensland. It's a unicameral system there, one house, for those who don't understand the terminology. These different systems and different state experiences are really quite interesting, and you address them in your book. Can you tell me how the different states have experienced opposition and the role of the opposition, how that has developed with the different states?
In some of the states, oppositions have been in opposition a long time. And
you see that much more so in the states than you do in the federal. I mean, we obviously have the Menzies government and then his successors of 22 years of straight Liberal governments or coalition governments, which is extraordinary and I'm sure will never be repeated. But the states seem to have much more longevity in office than we have at a federal system, at least in my lifetime.
Well, I think you're right. And I think that's because although they have the Westminster system, they apply politics much more ruthlessly, right? And that's become worse in a sense because we don't have state media like we used to. I mean, the ABC used to run a program in each state called Stateline.
Yes, I
right?
remember
Once upon a time, okay? Yeah. So the ABC doesn't do that. Then they had it on Friday nights and they don't even do that anymore. So we don't have the concentration of media following the states. And state governments are much more willing to go through the appearances of Westminster. I mean, look at the Andrews government, look at Victoria. I mean, seriously, if you read the Ombudsman's report on politicalisation that came out in December last year, now what did it say? It didn't find overt partisan appointments, but boy, oh boy, it found that almost every rule book of the Westminster system was broken, that there weren't proper procedures for appointing people, that there was ministerial interference in appointments, that Parliament wasn't consulted. We only got that review because the upper house in Victoria referred the issue for the Ombudsman to investigate, which they could do under the Ombudsman's Act. Now, it just happened that the government didn't have the numbers in the upper house. That's how that happened. So you've got really much more vicious politics going on at the state level, and it's a bit limited. In New South Wales, you've got a strong upper house that holds the government down a bit, put them in their place a bit. You've got a few more independents and so on. Queensland, of course, hasn't got that, and that's one of the problems. So in Queensland, it's a winner takes all. You win the government, you've got everything. You've got the judiciary, you've got the public service, you've got the Treasury, you've got control of everything. There is no concept of having to follow the rules. We'll make the rules up as we go. Now, that's in variable levels around Australia. That's what happened. I said during the COVID, when Victoria was being treated like prison state, in a sense, to an academic or monash, well, what was the use of your Bill of Rights? Where's your critical article of the Andrews government about the lockdowns and the unnecessary rules that were being followed.
Well, I was at a conference the other day, which I think you were also at, and one of the academics said on an analysis of the states with a Bill of Rights and the states without a Bill of Rights, were human rights protected differently across the states? And the answer was no, the Bill of Rights did absolutely nothing to protect your human rights. But you were referring before, Scott, to the upper house and the importance of the upper house in terms of the role it plays in opposing the government of the day. We have upper house in the federal system, of course, the Senate and most of the states except Queensland. How important is the upper house as a part of the role of the opposition?
I think it's become more important since proportional voting came in, and it was put in by the Labor Party, 1948, basically to stymie Mr Menzies and to make sure there's going to be some positions for Labor senators, which they did. They got about 27 senators in the new 60-member Senate size. Now, the interesting thing about the Senate is because of proportional voting, you start to have the gradual development of minor parties in it. And so the government, Menzies had control of the upper house. He had a double dissolution in 1951 when he was being blocked, got control, and he did it again a bit later that decade. And it wasn't real till Fraser won in 1975 that he got control of the Senate. And then Howard got control of the Senate. No Labor government, federal government, has ever got control of the Senate. I think this is really interesting. And so you've had the gradual growth of independent minor parties and the political parties changing and people not joining them and concerns about trust and so on and so forth. There's an increasing number. So we now have in the Senate, Australian Senate, which is elected, by the way, the only upper house in Westminster systems that is elected. Okay, I think this is really important.
Yeah, it's important to reflect on that.
Yeah, New Zealand, by the way, abolished theirs in 1950. It wasn't a referendum, they just abolished it. Okay. Everyone thought it was a good idea.
The House of Lords is appointed.
I think the House of Lords is a joke. It's my personal view of it, okay? The people calling themselves lords and running around the place and thinking they're doing something useful. The Senate in Canada is appointed, right? Okay? I think you have to be over 75 and under 120 years of old to get appointed or something like that. So I wish Mr Trudeau would do something like that. I wish Mr Blair had done something about the House of Lords rather than banning fox hunting or something, which what he was on about. Now, the Senate is fantastic because you've got proportional voting and there's been tweaks to that system and you start getting minor parties. Now, governments hate it, of course, because Westminster system is actually, it's sort of bicameral, but the idea is the executive government's in control. Now, this is really thumbing a nose at that. So we've got a really different version of Westminster. And we've now got 18 senators from minor parties, small parties, micro parties and independents. And some people who might be in the party, but they all have three different views, I can tell you now, since that. Now, what this means is that executive government, it's got control of the House of Representatives, it's the government, but it's going to have to negotiate with the Senate.
Does this make the formal opposition's role less important then? Because the rise of the Teals and the crossbench, of course, in the Senate, they then become really the people, well, the political players who determine what gets through or not. And so their critiques are actually going to have a meaningful impact on the legislative agenda of the day? Or is the formal opposition still important as that alternative party of government waiting, ready to, if they win the election, take over and pursue their policy agenda?
Well, the formal opposition is still important because they still have the biggest chunk in the Senate.
But less and less.
As
we see two major parties' primary votes decreasing in the Senate in our proportional system, we do see more and more of these minor parties and independents.
So that means the government's got to be much more astute at what they're doing. So there's several games they can play. They can do a deal with the opposition and sideline the crossbench. That's one thing they can do. And they sometimes might do that. They might want to sideline the Greens. We'll make the Greens look irrelevant. And therefore, voting for the Greens is a waste of time because they'd have no influence. So we'll do a deal with the opposition. It's better than doing a deal with the other mob. Or we'll do a deal with some of the minor micro groups and so on. Or we'll do a deal with the crossbench. And which parts of the crossbench will we do the deal with? Do we want to do the Greens? Greens are very difficult to deal with, so we'll try and isolate them. Or do we do something with the Greens to make all the others and to make the opposition look irrelevant, right? So there's all these choices, and it's going to depend on the issue and how clever and good they are at negotiating these processes. And this is something which executive government Australia is not used to. This is just something a bit strange. In America, this is pretty normal, right? Because America, governments have got to negotiate their budget through. That's normal. In Australia, the idea we've got to negotiate with the other house, who do they think they are, sort of thing. This is very much against the notion. Now, governments will use all sorts of arguments. We've got a mandate, we've been elected by this proportion of the people, you're unrepresentative swill, the Keating comment. But the trouble is the Senate is elected. That's the problem. They've got a certain legitimacy, not maybe as immediate as the House. They are not just appointed cronies, if you like. This is what makes the whole game really interesting. And now a lot of people out there in Voterland think, and I've done lots of talks to community groups, voting for an independent is a really good thing, but be careful what you wish for. What you could wish for is a government of inertia, of things not being done, or things being so compromised they're irrelevant. Do you understand what you do when you vote for an independent? Because you don't know what that independent or micro party, what their vote is on some issue in the future. With a major political party, they have a basic philosophy. They will be for or against certain things. Once you vote for One Nation or the Lambie Party, what it may be, what is going to be their stance on this issue? So be careful what you may end up with, whereby government could come to a standstill.
I mean, you make an argument, I guess, for the two-party system, but we're seeing more and more people actually dissatisfied with that system. Do you think that the formal opposition will become potentially a thing of the past and we'll have these more multi-party arrangements where there might be a formal opposition, but actually when it comes to forming government, they then will need to form it in a coalition, so Labor and the Greens or Labor and the Teals, or, you obviously have the coalition, the Liberal and National parties, but maybe it's bringing together right-leaning independents to form a group that can actually present a viable alternative.
Well, look, Ian Marsh, the late Ian Marsh, wrote a number of books and articles, which at the time everyone thought he was crazy, because he was talking about, and I think everyone should read his stuff, and I did talk to him a couple of times before he died, that with the fragmentation of society, the decline of religion, decline of a agreed moral compass, what do you want to call it, and society is becoming more segmentised, if you like, into little groups and different views, that the major parties can't cope with this anymore, right? I mean, you really can't call the Labor Party a working class party. Seriously. Who's working class in the Labor Party? Who? Mr Hawke? Was he working class? Well, Paul Keating? Not really. His father ran a small business. The major parties having real trouble stretching to incorporate all the different groups. John Howard talks about the Liberal Party being a broad church, but a lot of people don't want to be in church, That's the problem, all right? A lot of people hunt around for what party to join, what's going to advance my career. So the parties have got to sort of think about how they're going to cope with this changing trend. People are becoming more selective in what they're voting, where you're right. Back in 1974, the major parties got 90% of the primary vote. At the 2022 election, they got 67%.
It's a big change.
Vote. And that's happening in other countries. So, the recent European Parliament election, the so-called right-wing party, they're outpolled in Germany, 16% of the vote, outpolled the Socialist Party, behind the Christian Democrats. I mean, what vote did the Social Democrats get if the German right-wing party got 16% vote? So that's a really interesting, and a lot of Germans are very upset about this because they like to have this cooperative sort of atmosphere and process. So I think the parties have really got to think about that. Now, I don't think it's the end of the major parties, but I think it means they've got to be much cleverer about how they articulate their viewpoints and policies on things. And I still think the electorate likes clear viewpoints and clear enunciations of where people are coming from. And I think maybe the drift to the minor parties is certainly on the non-Labor side of politics, which I can speak on, a lot of people feel the Liberal Party doesn't represent their views.
Well, something that is going to be a clear contest at the next election will be the question over nuclear energy. We have had today a major announcement of the opposition leader on where, if he were elected, nuclear power stations would be placed around Australia. I noticed all the state governments are saying, not in my backyard, thanks. So how that would be affected, I'm not sure. But it's interesting, this will be an election where we do see that very stark choice between the opposition and the government. They really, truly disagree on a fundamental question. And perhaps that's a nice change from elections past in more recent times.
We saw it in the Voice referendum.
Yes, that wasn't a federal election, though.
No, I know.
But I think it's really interesting.
It would have been very easy for the coalition, which the opinion polls were saying at the time, to go along with that referendum. And my view at the time was, if the coalition went along the referendum, the Liberal Party was finished. That's my view, okay? Because many people who are Liberal voters, and I don't like using the word conservative, that no one represents them on a whole range of issues. That's why you had One Nation develop and all those other fringe parties. So the Liberal Party in particular, the Labor Party has become captured by the inner city elite and the educated elite. They're not the working class party, partly because we've got rid of part of the working class in demanufacturing Australia and all other things. So they've got those different games going on. But Lise Dutton is putting out an alternative, and I think what he's been very clever on The Voice is he brought the party with him. I myself think The Voice was done to fragment the Liberal Party, because everyone thought that the party would fragment.
Something you have remarked on in this book, of course, is how damaging disunity can be to an opposition, and an effective opposition must be united. And I know you've got comments in the book from John Howard about how you develop a program in opposition and you need to be united as an opposition around that program in order to prevail. So being united on all the range of issues in the upcoming election is, I guess, a lesson you would provide an opposition leader of the day.
That's right. I can't understand in modern political parties why politicians on the same side have their arguments and debates in public. I find this really strange. You're in a party, you're only elected because you've got Liberal Party behind your name or ALP behind your name. Let's be really, really honest. It's not because of your sparkling personality, because most of the electorate don't know you. Now, I'm all in favour of debate and fight and argument inside the party room. What really, really, really bugs me is people having a shot at each other on Sky News or whatever it may be to get some sort of short-term gain for their personality, or people who leak from the party side. I find this really, really strange. Now, just think of Mr. Howard. He had to put up with the Country Party or the National Party with their Joe for Canberra campaign. He had to put up with the coalition breaking up. He had to put up with being stabbed in the back by his fellow members and losing the position, and one of them telling him to fade away. John, there's no future for you. And fortunately, he stuck around. So unity is really important, but you can't have unity unless you really know what you're unified for. Why doesn't the opposition do such and such and do these things? You've got to know what you're for so you can go out and fight the fight. If you don't have a cause, it's pretty hard to go out and fight the fight.
So clarity of purpose is pretty essential. Well, Scott Prasser, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light to talk about the art of opposition. It's a great book. It's published by Connor Court and available on their website, which I'm sure we'll put in the show notes. And we're very, very proud here at the Robert Menzies Institute to be hosting the launch of this book. So,
thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.